I was born and raised in Williamsburg. I grew up here in Williamsburg in the 50s. My parents bought a house in what is now the Hasidic community, portion of the community. And so it was a very different community then. When I was growing up, the neighborhood was totally integrated. All immigrant families, primarily. Puerto Rican, there were Puerto Rican families, there were Irish families, Italian families, German families. Even my best friend growing up was Chinese. There was African American families. It was a really rich and diverse community at the time. It slowly transitioned to being primarily a Hasidic, Satmar Hasidic community, closer to the mid and end of the 60s. So my very early experience in the community was really rich and diverse. I went to school here, the Catholic school at the Parish Transfiguration Church, which is in the community. And I think it was there that really I found so much of who I am. I mean, I think that was the foundation of who I am and my vocation and my path in my life. Transfiguration was a really robust Catholic church. It had a very, very active youth component. And it was what I say is the citadel of liberation theology. There were priests and there were nuns there that really believed that the gospel, according to Jesus Christ, really was totally and completely linked to social justice and really, fighting for the rights of people to live a dignified life. And so my very formative years, not only going to school there, but then becoming part of that parish in my teenage years, most of my formative teenage years was in Transfiguration, and I was part of what was called the Young Christian Students, which was part of the Young Christian movement, Young Christian Workers movement that was not only in our community, but worldwide. It was there that I met many other young people like myself and a little older who were all committed to the same thing. We were part of projects and activities in the community that were about social justice, whether that was housing, was that education. I remember one summer working in a storefront in the community in an apartment building and doing a Montessori class for the children in the community. This is my neighborhood, and so I think that experience of really being able to grow up in my own community and be part of really making change and really being involved in, I want to say, and this is, I think what I've started to really understand the deeper nature of what does it mean to love your sisters and brothers, right? And to really dedicate one's life to really making sure that, we have our rights to a dignified life and living a dignified life. The community was very, very challenged. We work primarily in Los Sures, and it was, a challenge in terms of tenements and the quality of the people living in the tenement houses. To tell you sort of the power of these priests and nuns, they did not live in the rectory. They lived among the people. They lived in Los Sures. They lived in an apartment building. And so the reality of what the people and the families of our community were living, they lived also. And it was from there that they really organized, all of us to really be able to fight for better conditions, to make sure that we had tutoring programs for our children, to make sure that we, the teenagers of the community, had activities where we could be engaged, in terms of how to better the community. And it was there that I actually found my artist spirit. I was part of what was called the Drama Guild. And so, all of us in the community for the summer were part of this Drama Guild and putting on plays. And, you know, it wasn't just a extracurricular activity. It was really for many of us an opening in looking at what was possible for all of us in life, to see ourselves in a different sort of context. And for me, I think it was very profound in terms of seeing myself as an artist and how I connected that to my activism. And I think that was the platform for how and which way in 1980 I became involved with El Puente. I think the thing that I do want to say about that time and why it's so important was because many of us who grew up in the community at that time, myself being a teenager and the young adults, were also committed to coming back to the community. And I think what was really dynamic about the history of Los Sures in terms of social justice and the social justice movement was that many of us who came back to the community, stayed in the community, really focused on building organizations and institutions that would start to create systemic change in terms of the social conditions, but also in terms of the environmental conditions, in terms of the educational system, in terms of the health and wellness of our community, understanding there were extreme challenges. And so, you know, out of Transfiguration came the founders of Los Sures, Nuestros Niños, which was the first early childhood, bilingual early childhood developmental center in the city, and El Puente in the 1980s, right? To talk about what Los Sures was like in the 70s and in the 80s and much of the 90s was to really understand what, first and foremost, many poor communities, disenfranchised communities of color were experiencing at that time. This was the height of the Reagan cuts. And so most of the infrastructure of this community, like many other communities, was in total disarray. Most of our buildings, there were a lot of shells and burnt out buildings, abandoned buildings in the community. There were no trees in the community, no green spaces in the community. Many of our social service organizations or agencies were non-existent. Our schools were one of the poorest performing and most violent in the community. We were probably the second most or the most, one of the poorest Latino congressional districts in the country at the time. And so we also had health crisis. We had the highest levels of asthma and respiratory disease in the city. And that continues to be the case in this community. And that is pretty much and primarily because of the infrastructure of this community, which has the Williamsburg Bridge, the BQE intersecting with a bus terminal, one of the largest bus terminals in Brooklyn, as well as one of the highest rates at one time of waste transfer stations in the community. You put all of that kind of infrastructure together in a small community like Los Sures, and you really start to see what kind of environmental disaster that then speaks to the health and wellness crisis in this community that we were experiencing at a deadly rate in terms of the 80s and the 90s and still today. The other thing that I think that it's really important to note was really in terms of there were no real services for our young people. It was the height of the gangs in Los Sures. We were seen as the gang capital of New York City. There was an influx of drugs and there was an influx of violence that followed. In 1980, when we founded El Puente, we started to create the development team for the creation of El Puente. 48 young people died in this community from violence. And that is extraordinary when you think about 48 young people dying in 1 year in a small community like Los Sures. And so it was a number of us who came together, who had come back to the community, who were still here in the community, like myself, Gino Maldonado, as well as Luis Gardner Costa, who actually convened us all. He was working at the hospital in the community, Greenpoint Hospital. He was an administrator. Gino was at Los Sures. And I had come back to the community and had started my own dance and fine arts program, as well as working part-time at Nuestros Niños Daycare Center in the after school program. And so we came together as well as many other activists and workers in the community to really start to come together to say, what is it that we wanted to do to really start to address the issues? But I think in large part, we were always focused on the self-determination of the people in this community. So it was more about how are we going to take back our community and use the leverage of organizations and institutions like Los Sures and Nuestros Niños. And now what developed and what we decided to do was to start our own organization called El Puente that would be focused primarily on young people. We realized that the crisis among young people, what was happening to young people, needed to be addressed. And so what we decided to do, very much in the spirit and in the lived experience of ourselves growing up in this community, was to say that we were going to focus all of our attention and our talents and our skills to create a safe space, a caring space, an empowering space for the young people of our community. And so that was the genesis of El Puente. Really focusing on not the deficits. And I think that was what it was from the very beginning, was to flip the mindset, a mindset of how and in which way we were institutionalized to really see ourselves as less than, to flip that narrative and to really start to see ourselves with the power and the assets that we have and had to really be able to take back this community, build this community, and really find solutions and facilitate the solutions to really start to transform this community into a thriving community for ourselves and for our families going forward. And so that was really the focus, how to create a space where young people could come, feel safe. They could come, like I say, and bring their dreams, not their problems, but their dreams, their aspirations, and to find here the possibility of building relationships with loving and caring and responsible adults, many of whom, like myself, who came from this community, who would be there to support them in realizing their dreams. So our mindset was around assets, not deficits. It was really about how and in which way we would use our power, reclaim our power to really be able to create transformative change in this community. And that would be led by young people. In the 40 years that we have been here, is that we find ourselves in this really, I think, powerful and crossroads, right? For 40 years, we've been working here in this community and in Bushwick, that we have been in Bushwick now for 30 years, really raising issues, right? We had some iconic campaigns and we led iconic struggles in this community around issues of the environment, issues of, clean air. We stopped the building of an incinerator in this community, a 55-story incinerator in the 90s that would have only created more of the toxic air that our young people and our children and our families have been breathing would only add to the health crisis. We addressed the issue of asthma in this community and did community surveys of looking at where and how not only the toxic air that we were breathing, but also the kinds of chemicals that people were using in their houses would add to their own, their health and wellness. We partnered with, many agencies, the Department of Health and others, to really look at the issue of asthma in this community and really create wellness workshops in terms of how our residents could support. We focused in on green spaces. And so we planted 100 trees in this community. Our young people from the El Puente Academy did part of their project-based learning project, portfolio project, was to work with the city to plant 100 trees in this community. There were no trees in this community. They did community surveys and realized there were no trees in the community. And so they planted and planned with the city to grow and plant those trees. And now you see tree-lined streets in Los Sures. Many of those were because of young people in the El Puente Academy for Peace and Justice. We've been waging an ongoing, struggle for the quality of air in this community. It continues to this day. It continues in a campaign that we have been waging, which is Our Air in Nuestro Aire, where our young people actually work with the Barry Commoner Center for Environmental Justice at Queens College, and we're doing a monitoring, a survey and a monitoring of the air quality in this community. The young people here in our after-school leadership centers, as well as in our academy, and really found that, our air is full of toxins, lethal toxins, which really attribute to the continued crisis in terms of respiratory disease, asthma. Almost every young person in our membership has someone in their family who has asthma. We've had members here at El Puente who have died of asthma, who have had family members who have died of asthma. And when you think about that and you put that together with the struggle that we still have in terms of quality health care in this community, you can see where and how, given what we are experiencing, what we experience and are still experiencing in terms of the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, everything that we know now about how and in which way the inequities of communities like Los Sures around the country, in this city, disenfranchised communities of color have really bore the brunt of the devastation of COVID for all of the social and environmental and climate and health inequities. That is exactly the challenge that we face here and continue to face with our families. And yet in all, we are there and continuing to organize, having our young people work, and lead the kinds of campaigns and the kinds of services and the kinds of putting forth the kinds of solutions that are necessary to really continue to fight for equity in this community. I think a big part of our work has been coalition building, and we have done that from the very beginning, building bridges, as our name suggests, El Puente, with the other communities in this neighborhood, whether that be the Hasidic community, the African American community, the Polish community, the Italian American community. We have built those bridges to really form these very powerful coalitions of people who are committed to the issue of equity and justice in this community. I think what keeps me hopeful and keeps me inspired are the young people of El Puente. When I say young people, I'm talking about the 6-year-olds all the way to the 60-year-olds, and I say that in terms of, how and in which way I even continue to be inspired, by the young people of El Puente. I think, we see a moment in time when all of the substantial movements for justice in this country, and I would say in the world, are being led by young people. Young people who have a vision, young people who are really clear about their own power, and their own will, to self-determination. And I think that, that is exactly what I would say to young people, is to believe in your own power to make change. Believe in your own capacity to create transformation. And I think, and also be very, very, committed to building bridges, to build coalitions, across ethnic and racial groups, across sectors. I think, that is the one thing that I think now there is so much capacity to do. But I think, for us here at El Puente, there are 4 cornerstone principles, and I would share those out in terms of where and how I would say to young people, it's always important to be clear about what is non-negotiable. And those are your values. What is it that you believe in? What is it that drives you in terms of your own path and your own commitment to bringing justice into the world? And here at El Puente, it is 4 core principles. It's creating community, love and caring, our commitment to mastery, and our commitment to peace and justice. And I think that as long as we listen to our hearts that will tell us what is the right thing to do, then we can never go wrong. We will always be on the right path to justice.